In this lecture, we're going to introduce the endocrine system as well as just some of the general features of the endocrine system. And some of the functions of the endocrine system is that the secreted chemicals will function to increase metabolism of various cells in the body. One such compound that carries out this function is epinephrine. The endocrine system will also secrete hormones, secrete chemicals that will be involved with the control of food intake and digestion. And one general hormone that will be addressed later is insulin. Growth hormone is a hormone secreted by the endocrine system that will contribute to tissue maturation and tissue growth. The regulation of ions in extracellular fluids is assisted by the secretion of aldosterone. Water balance is another function that is regulated by actions of the endocrine system through the secretion of a hormone simply summarized as ADH, which stands for antidiuretic hormone. Increasing heart rate and blood pressure regulation is also affected, as addressed in the first function here, by epinephrine. And the control of blood glucose and other nutrients, as will be discussed a little bit later, is balanced by the secretion of two hormones, insulin and glucagon. Reproductive function is regulated by two hormones that are secreted from the anterior pituitary, follicle stimulating hormone and luteinizing hormone. Uterine contractions and milk release is regulated by the secretion of a hormone referred to as oxytocin, and various functions related to the immune system are also regulated by secretions of the endocrine system. Before we begin a further detailed examination of the glands of the endocrine system, the overall examination of the endocrine system involves the secretion of chemical messengers. And the chemical messengers can act either locally or at a distance from the cells from which those messengers were secreted. And the autocrine type of messenger refers to compounds produced and secreted by cells that will have an effect on the actual cell that secreted those. And so some of the examples here include the response to inflammation and the secretions of white blood cells. Paracrine signals are generated by cells that will have an effect on nearby cells. And so this is typically seen in the vascular system where cells of the cardiovascular system will produce secretions that will affect nearby cells, particularly smooth muscle cells. Histamine, as an example, is secreted by cells that will promote vasodilation. And nitric oxide is another compound produced by cardiovascular cells that will promote vasodilation as well by affecting nearby smooth muscle cells as depicted in this picture. Neurotransmitters are secretions of the nervous system by neurons that will affect nearby cells, either other neurons or muscle cells, as we see in the neuromuscular system. So alpha motor neurons will secrete acetylcholine as the neurotransmitter that will result in the activation of a skeletal muscle cell. And the vast majority of this unit will address the endocrine system, which refers to the production of various chemicals by cells that will get into the cardiovascular system and affect tissues distant from the cells that produced those secretions, which we typically refer to as hormones. Some of the general characteristics of the endocrine system is that we focus on glands, and glands are organs that will produce chemical messengers, which we refer to as hormones, and will transmit those chemical messengers to distant tissues through the cardiovascular system. And these are chemicals that will bind to distant cells and will have a direct effect on altering that distant cell's physiology. So some of the general characteristics regarding hormones is that the human organism will generally produce hormones in rather small quantities. Those hormones, those chemicals will be secreted, released by the producing cell into the intercellular space, or the space outside the cell, and will eventually move into the cardiovascular or the circulatory system, and through which those compounds will move throughout the body and will bind to receptors on target tissues. The receptors refer to proteins, specialized proteins embedded in the membranes of the cells that make up those target tissues. And the overall function of the endocrine system is to regulate activities of all body structures and all tissues, although the endocrine system will affect different tissues in different ways and affect the metabolism of those cells at various rates. The ligand is a term that is a very general term that refers to these chemical signals. So when a gland produces a chemical messenger or a hormone, it will act as a ligand that will bind to a protein functioning as a receptor embedded in the membrane of a distant cell. To understand the endocrine system is to compare it with the nervous system. And so there are some similarities between the nervous system and the endocrine system. The first similarity is that both systems are associated with the brain or the central nervous system. So the hypothalamus is a gland located deep in the brain that plays a very important role with downstream function of many human physiological activities. And so the hypothalamus generally regulates many physiological functions, and it does so in part by secreting hormones. The epithalamus is another region in the brain that is involved with melatonin secretion. That is a compound that functions to regulate wake-sleep cycles, but also functions in a nervous system function with the sense of smell, which is olfaction. The second similarity is that the nervous and the endocrine systems may use the same chemical messenger as a neurotransmitter and as a hormone. One such example is epinephrine. So epinephrine is a type of adrenaline hormone that functions as a neurotransmitter for the sympathetic nervous system, but the exact same compound is released by the adrenal gland, and as such, the release by the adrenal gland will see epinephrine migrating into the cardiovascular system, where it then circulates throughout the entire body and is viewed as a hormone. Both systems, nervous system and endocrine systems, are considered to be cooperative. And as such, the nervous system is known to secrete what are called neuroendocrine peptides. And these are chemical messengers, hence endocrine types of compounds, that originate from nervous system tissue and usually exists as a small protein, or often referred to as a peptide, and are also referred to as neurohormones. And they are produced and moved directly into the cardiovascular system. And these particularly are secreted by the posterior pituitary gland, and the two major hormones secreted by the posterior pituitary gland are ADH, which stands for antidiuretic hormone, and oxytocin. Some parts of the endocrine system are innervated directly by the nervous system, with the example we cited in similarity number 2 with the adrenal gland. And so we saw with the sympathetic nervous system will send long axons of those neurons and directly activate the central part of the adrenal gland to produce epinephrine and to secrete epinephrine into the cardiovascular system. As there are similarities between the nervous and endocrine system, so does exist differences. And the first difference is the mode of transport. We know that the axon is the mode of communication for the nervous system through the transmission of action potentials. The blood, however, is the mode of transport for the endocrine system. And because the endocrine system is defined by the production and secretion of a chemical that will affect a distant tissue, the only way it can get to the distant tissue is through transport in the cardiovascular system. The speed of the response is another major difference between both systems, where the nervous system is not quite instant, but as close as you can get to instant. But the responses are very, very fast when neurons are activated. The endocrine system tends to be more of a delayed type of response and can take seconds or minutes in order to respond to some stimulus. The duration of the response, once it is triggered, once again here, we see with the nervous system at most will sustain activity for up to a few seconds, but mostly very, very fast in terms of milliseconds. However, the endocrine system, when stimulated, can continue to secrete compounds for anywhere between a few minutes up to a number of days, and really depends upon the particular type of gland. And the fourth difference is what we simply summarize as amplitude or frequency modulated. So on the upper figure here, on the upper right-hand portion of the slide, here we see time along our x-axis in minutes to hours and hormone concentration in the blood. And so the hormone response to a stimulus tends to be amplitude modulated. In other words, the strength of the stimulus or the strength of a signal will result in a greater hormone production and secretion into the cardiovascular system. And this is typical of the endocrine system. So as we see a stronger and even stronger signal that is generated, which will stimulate cells of the endocrine system to produce and secrete a hormone, it's the concentration, the magnitude of those hormones will be a function of the strength of that signal. As opposed to the nervous system, which is frequency modulated. And as we can see here, that the absolute level of the action potential, the response in millivolts, is always going to be the same, and it's usually around positive 30 millivolts. However, with a stronger signal, the absolute magnitude of the potential difference does not change. What changes is the frequency of appearance of those action potentials. So with a stronger stimulus, we see the same magnitude of the electrical potential disturbance. However, the number of action potentials will increase in the same period of time. So this ends part 1 of our Unit 5 unit on the endocrine system.